Have you ever felt like life today is less like a clear paved highway and more like, well, like a winding dirt road with
Hmm.
a million potential detours?
Hmm.
We constantly hear about flexible careers,
Mm.
patchwork lives, non-traditional families. It just feels like everything is less structured.
Right. That feeling is definitely out there.
But is that just a feeling, maybe a collective perception swirling around us? Or is there actual hard data that shows a widespread de-standardization of the life course?
That's a profound question, actually. And it really cuts to the heart of how we understand social change. So many popular narratives hinge on this idea that everything is becoming more individualized, maybe more chaotic.
Yeah.
It's exactly the kind of big question we love to unpack.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources, could be articles, research papers, even just notes, and we really try to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. Our goal is to give you that shortcut to being truly well-informed,
Mm.
without the overwhelm. Today, we're diving into a fascinating academic paper from 2005 by Hannah Bruckner and Carl Ulrich Mayer. Its title perfectly sums up what we're trying to do today: de-standardization of the life course, what it might mean, and if it means anything, whether it actually took place.
And what makes this paper so valuable is that it doesn't just theorize or, give anecdotes. It's grounded in incredibly rich longitudinal data. We're talking about the German Life History Study.
Right.
Imagine tracking entire birth cohorts in West Germany from those born way back in 1921 all the way up to 1971.
Wow, that's a huge span.
It is. That's half a century. It gives us this unique, long-term empirical lens on how people's lives have genuinely changed, or perhaps haven't changed quite as much as we think over decades.
So our mission today is to really unravel this complex idea of life course de-standardization. We'll explore what the term even means, in an academic sense.
Yeah, the definitions matter.
They do. And why so many people have come to believe it's happening on this grand scale. And then, most importantly, we're going to look at what the systematic data from this German study actually reveals.
Hmm.
Is it truly taking place? And if so, where?
Exactly. Where are the changes and where is the stability?
You're going to walk away from this deep dive with a much clearer, much more nuanced understanding of what's really shifted in how lives unfold in modern society. Or maybe what hasn't.
Let's find out.
Okay, so let's kick off with the prevailing idea in sociology for a long time, the historical backdrop the authors set for us. For decades, the dominant thought was actually the opposite of de-standardization. It was that lives were becoming more standardized.
Right. Counterintuitive now, isn't it?
Totally. Picture this, a highly predictable sequence. You finish education, then you enter a stable job, probably with one company for life.
Mm-hmm. The career ladder.
Yeah, the career ladder.
Yeah.
Then marriage, kids, and finally, retirement at a fixed age. It was almost like there was this universally accepted script for adulthood that most people followed.
And this wasn't just some, quaint historical notion. What's truly fascinating is understanding why this view held such sway, especially right through the 1970s and early 1980s.
Okay.
This was an era deeply influenced by something called modernization theory. The core idea was basically that as societies industrialized and developed, they'd naturally become more organized, more rational.
Or orderly.
Exactly, more orderly. And consequently, life paths would become more uniform. Think about, say, the industrial factory floor. It demanded a certain conformity, a strict schedule, clear career ladders.
Right.
And then, crucially, came the rise and expansion of the welfare state. These were powerful institutional forces that truly shaped and structured lives in ways we sometimes forget today.
That makes a lot of sense. So it wasn't just a cultural norm, like this is what people do, but these tangible mechanisms were actively funneling people into those predictable paths. Can you break down what those driving forces were? What made lives more standardized back then?
Absolutely. Several key mechanisms were really pushing in that direction, creating what felt like a truly standardized life script.
Okay.
First, think about education. There was this massive expansion of secondary and tertiary education systems. Now, the weird thing is, while education would later contribute to de-standardization in some ways, at this initial stage, it actually created more defined career paths. Young adults were increasingly launched into specific, predetermined entry positions based on their education level.
Okay, so it sorted people.
It did. It minimized that early search mobility, the kind of chaotic job hopping we might see today, and seemed to secure their employment trajectories. It was like a well-designed series of educational pipelines guiding people towards structured futures.
Gotcha. Pipeline's a good word for it.
Secondly, work itself became a powerful standardizer. We saw the rise of larger, more stable work organizations, stronger trade unions, and a big increase in secure
Ah,
white-collar jobs.
right, the organization man era.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. This led to what we call careers in the traditional sense long term. Stable employment with enhanced occupational stability over a person's lifespan. And economic growth during this period, coupled with an upgrading of the occupational structure, actually favored voluntary job shifts and upward mobility. People moved up.
Ah, so stability didn't mean stagnation.
Not necessarily then. It was a stark contrast to earlier, more turbulent times when job changes were often involuntary, horizontal, or even downward. You join a company, and you largely stayed there, climbing the ladder.
Okay, what else?
Thirdly, the burgeoning welfare state played a monumental role. Its provisions effectively institutionalized new kinds of statuses and events, buffering individuals against life's uncertainties.
Like what kind of provisions?
Think about sick leave, maternity leave, unemployment benefits, pensions. These weren't just perks. They were safety nets that fostered continuity and predictability.
Ah, so you could plan.
You could plan. People had a sense of security, allowing them to follow a more linear, less risky progression through life because the state was providing a backstop against the unexpected.
Okay. Education, work, welfare state. What about family?
And finally, family life mirrored this standardization. The relative security of income, employment, and career advancement supported earlier marriages and, often, larger families. It made the traditional nuclear family unit a more viable and widespread norm.
So it all fit together.
It all fit together. The culmination of all these forces was that lives truly became more predictable, more uniform, and, as the authors described it, collectively patterned. Researchers back in 1976 showed through historical comparisons that events making up the transitions to adulthood became more universal, more temporally connected, and showed less age variation. The consensus was strong. Society was moving towards this highly structured, predictable life course.
So for a good while, that was the dominant view. Predictable, maybe even a bit. Rigid, but predictable. But then, as the late 1980s rolled around, something shifted dramatically. Counter-observations started piling up. Suddenly, the common perception wasn't about predictability anymore. It was about lives being less predictable, more flexible, and increasingly individualized. What on earth fueled this almost complete reversal in the story we told ourselves?
It's a critical turning point, isn't it? What forces created this new lens through which we started viewing life courses? There were several powerful currents all hitting around the same time.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Firstly, the value changes that swept across Western societies in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These were pervasive shifts, often associated with youth and student rebellions.
Right, self-expression, autonomy.
Exactly. There was a burgeoning demand for greater autonomy and self-realization. A deep desire to define one's own path rather than just following the prescribed one. And this directly impacted family life. We started seeing delayed marriage, delayed childbirth, a rise in non-marital unions, increased rates of divorce and remarriage.
Okay.
Young people also began leaving parental homes earlier and, crucially, independently of marriage. That suggested a growing disorderliness, maybe, in young adult lives compared to before.
So values changed first. What else?
Secondly, and perhaps ironically, educational expansion itself started to contribute to this perceived de-standardization. While it initially created structured paths,
Pipeline.
it eventually led to what's often called educational credential inflation. More people getting higher degrees meant securing a stable traditional job right after graduating became much harder.
Right, more competition.
Exactly. Education, for some, effectively turned into a waiting hall, a place young people lingered, getting more qualifications while struggling to find their footing in a tougher workforce. That definitely didn't feel like a smooth, predictable path.
No, that sounds stressful.
Then the women's movement also provided a powerful independent force. It fundamentally reshaped lives for both genders by encouraging women to pursue education and careers, partly or even entirely separate from traditional family formation.
Right, breaking the old mold.
Absolutely. This naturally introduced a much wider variety of life trajectories, especially for women, moving away from that single dominant pathway of homemaker and mother.
Okay, values, education, women's movement, anything else.
And then we had the economic shocks. The 1973 oil shock, for instance, its full consequences really hit the training and labor markets by the 1980s. This made getting vocational and professional credentials, and also the transition into gainful work, much more prolonged and complicated. It wasn't as straightforward anymore.
So it got harder to follow the plan.
It did. This potent mix of changing values, new opportunities like women's education, and these external economic constraints fostered concepts like the postponed generation and the idea of individualized or patchwork biographies. People genuinely started seeing their lives as something they had to kind of piece together rather than follow a smooth, linear progression.
Patchwork biographies, the phrase really captures it. And as we stepped into the early 1990s, the narrative shifted again, didn't it? Globalization became the big buzzword. How did that add fuel to this fire of perceived de-standardization and risk?
Yeah, by the early 90s, the overwhelming perception was that these massive impacts from globalization were creating difficult, often involuntary adaptations. We're talking about increased international competition, labor market deregulation, structural unemployment.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? What some in the 70s and 80s might have viewed as a widening of life pathways due to new options, like more choices, were now being reinterpreted as difficult adaptations to external constraints. The feeling shifted. It wasn't just, I have more choices, it was, things are harder, riskier.
Okay, so the interpretation changed.
The interpretation changed, and the context changed too. This was further exacerbated by significant policy changes. We saw reforms and cuts in Social Security provisions, things like unemployment benefits, health insurance, pension entitlements.
Shrinking safety nets?
Exactly. That drastically increased individuals' exposure to risks. And this wasn't just in the public sphere of work, it impacted family life too. So the 90s were seen as increasing both the incidence of exposure to risks, especially in the labor market and family life, and impacting the level of welfare assistance available. It felt like the ground was less stable beneath your feet.
Wow. So that whole stable period.
Yeah, in retrospect, that period of stable employment, rising incomes, robust welfare protection, early marriages, stable family lives, what some had called a golden age, now seemed like a short and exceptional historical period.
Just a blip.
Perceived as a blip, yeah. Both preceded and succeeded by more turbulent times and, by extension, more turbulent, less predictable lives. This led to a broad consensus among both academic and journalistic observers about postmodern patterns. They generally agreed on a greater variety of life trajectories, which were seen as partly freely chosen.
I want this flexibility.
And partly imposed by these new, riskier conditions. I have to be flexible. It was a powerful, widely accepted narrative. De-standardization was simply happening, full stop.
Okay, let's unpack this further then, because we've just navigated through decades of shifting perceptions. And you're right, there are so many terms flying around, often used interchangeably. De-standardization, individualization, deinstitutionalization, pluralization. The authors of this paper really stress how crucial it is to define them precisely before we even dare to look at the data. Can you systematically break down the key concepts this paper distinguishes? Maybe give us some concrete examples to make them crystal clear.
Absolutely. Precision here is paramount because these concepts, while they sound related, are distinct and crucially, they don't always move in the same direction. It's like trying to understand a complex machine. You need to know what each gear does before you can see how they all interact, right?
That makes sense.
Okay, first up, we have institutionalization versus deinstitutionalization.
Okay.
Definition. This refers to the formal rules, whether they're normative, like social expectations, or legal or organizational, that define how lives are structured, both socially and over time. Think of it as the established frameworks. Formal stages like education, marriage, retirement, or state-defined statuses like maternity leave. The idea is that modern life courses become a way society organizes itself, integrates people, even controls them to some extent. They're the societal guardrails.
Guardrails, okay. So what's deinstitutionalization then?
Deinstitutionalization examples. The paper points to how, say, in some countries like the U.S., education and work have become highly synchronous activities. Traditionally, you finished school, then you started working. Clear separation. But now it's common for people to be studying and working part-time or taking a year off to work before going back to school. Those activities are happening together, blurring the lines between those life stages. That's a form of deinstitutionalization.
Okay.
Another example is the rise of non-marital unions. Establishing a joint household is no longer necessarily tied to getting married first. Marriage, in this sense, becomes partially deinstitutionalized. It's less of a mandatory gateway step. Even things like homeschooling, where early education steps outside the formal schooling institution, can be seen as a form of deinstitutionalization.
Got it. Okay, next concept.
Next, there's standardization versus de-standardization. This is really the core of our deep dive today.
Well, the main event.
Exactly. Definition. This refers to processes where specific states, events, or the sequences they occur in become more universal for a given population, or their timing becomes more uniform. A highly standardized pattern would be, say, if nearly everyone retired at exactly 65 or married at 24 within a very narrow window.
Okay, so very predictable timing and prevalence.
Precisely. De-standardization examples.
Hmm.
The authors note that, weirdly enough, marriage and parenthood in Western societies first became more standardized up until the 1970s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then, crucially, became more de-standardized afterwards. Other examples could include the rise of stopgap jobs at career entry, those temporary, often unrelated roles that don't fit neatly into a linear career path. Or the increasing fuzziness of the age at retirement in Germany, meaning people are leaving the workforce at increasingly varied ages, not just one expected age.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
Then we have differentiation versus de-differentiation.
Differentiate, like becoming more complex.
Kind of. Definition. Differentiation occurs when the number of distinct states or stages across a lifetime increases. Mayer, one of the authors, noted back in '91 how early life courses became more institutionally differentiated, broken down into publicly defined periods like preschool, elementary, secondary, tertiary education. That's differentiation. Another example is moving from a work life with very few long-term employers to frequent shifts between firms. That's a differentiation of work life. Even splitting a single vocational training period into several distinct ones counts. More steps, more stages.
And de-differentiation.
De-differentiation. This would be the opposite, where formerly split life periods become rejoined. However, the authors note it's actually quite rare. The implication is that differentiation, this trend towards more distinct stages, is the more common underlying process in modern lives.
Got it. More complex stages. Next.
Fourth, there's pluralization.
Pluralization. More options.
Exactly. Definition. This refers to an increase in the synchronous number of states or forms of life activity in a given population, or even within a single person's life. It's about more options existing at the same time.
Okay, examples.
Examples. This concept has been mostly applied to family forms. Think about the rise of non-marital unions, increased divorce rates, more single mothers, or individuals living alone due to divorce or widowhood. These are all more options, more diverse forms of family coexisting in society.
Right.
A parallel example in the work sphere could be the increasing frequency of holding multiple jobs simultaneously, like juggling a day job, a side hustle, maybe some freelance work, more ways to organize work life existing at once.
Okay. And the last one.
And finally, a broader, more interpretive concept, individualization.
This is the one we hear all the time.
It is. Definition. This term is frequently invoked to refer to many of the changes we've just discussed. It's an interpretive concept, suggesting that individuals gain greater control over their lives and pursue a wider variety of life designs and trajectories. It implies personal choice and unique paths. My life, my way.
But there's a nuance.
There's a really important nuance. It's crucial to acknowledge the dual nature of this concept. While it can imply chosen variety and self-determination, I'm charting my own course, it can also mean being condemned, as some sociologists put it, to pursue trajectories that are not collectively well-trodden pathways.
Meaning riskier.
Riskier, yeah, and carrying less social support. The authors mention this as involuntary individualization, where you're forced into a unique path not by choice but by circumstance, like job loss or relationship breakdown. You're on your own, whether you like it or not.
That's a really important distinction. Chosen freedom versus forced flexibility.
Exactly. And the paper also specifically highlights changes often lumped under increasing flexibility in work like declining employment stability, decreased firm tenure, maybe declining occupational stability, less residential stability. The idea is that the overall stability of life is undermined by these labor market shifts.
Okay, so we have all these different concepts. Deinstitutionalization, de-standardization, differentiation, pluralization, individualization. Phew. Now, you said earlier, and this is where it gets really interesting, that these processes don't always move in the same direction. What are the crucial implications of that complexity? Why is it so vital to understand this nuance?
This is a truly critical takeaway, and it really challenges a lot of the common assumptions we carry around. The first big implication is simply that there is no single overarching trend. You can't just slap a label like de-standardized or individualized on everything and call it a day.
It's not that simple.
It's absolutely not that simple. For example, institutionalization, more rules, can actually be coupled with de-standardization, more variability. Think about early retirement policies. You create a formal institution, an early retirement scheme.
Right.
And that leads to a more varied, less standardized retirement age overall, because now people can retire early or at the standard age, or maybe even later. More rules, more variability.
Huh.
Or pluralization, more options might go hand in hand with standardization. For instance, if a period of non-marital cohabitation becomes almost universally practiced before marriage.
Which it kind of has, hasn't it?
In many places, yes. Well, that sequence, while it represents a new option, pluralization, could become a standardized part of relationship formation for a whole generation. A new standard emerges.
So things can move in opposite directions at the same time.
Exactly. Which leads to the second implication. We simply must beware of grand generalizations. You cannot assume one overarching unidirectional process is at play across all domains of life: work, family, education. If different dimensions can vary independently, then just invoking an overall trend might lead to more confusion than clarity. It's like saying the weather is always getting warmer globally, which might be true overall, but specific regions might be experiencing record cold spells. The local reality can differ from the general trend.
Don't paint everything with the same brush.
Precisely. And this leads directly to the third and perhaps most crucial implication: the overwhelming need for systematic data. Anecdotal evidence, our own personal experiences, or even compelling illustrative examples, while they feel powerful, are simply insufficient to understand such sweeping social changes.
Right. My life might feel chaotic, but does that mean everyone's does?
Exactly. To truly settle the debate whether you're a proponent or opponent of the de-standardization thesis, you absolutely need systematic data that both sides would accept as relevant. This means moving beyond speculation, beyond just vibes, to patient, painstaking measurement of empirical developments. It's the difference between guessing what's in a black box and carefully taking it apart to see its inner workings.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to the next phase of our deep dive. If grand generalizations and anecdotes aren't enough, how on earth do you measure something as abstract as de-standardization across thousands of real people's lives? What specific, concrete empirical indicators did these researchers actually pull out of the German life history study data to test this hypothesis?
This is where the paper really shines, methodologically speaking. It's a masterclass in operationalizing complex concepts. To empirically examine these changes, the researchers looked at specific aspects of life course transitions across that series of birth cohorts we mentioned. They developed a really precise set of indicators.
Okay, what were they measuring?
First, they looked at prevalence. Pretty straightforward. Has the extent to which a given transition or state occurs actually decreased over time? For example, is marriage becoming less common for people by age 30 within a cohort compared to previous cohorts?
Simple enough. Less common or not?
Second, and this is a really key one for getting at de-standardization, is age variance. This asks, have the ages at which transitions occur become more varied?
Ah, the spread.
Exactly, the spread. Think about it. If everyone delays marriage, but they all delay it to the same new age, say 30 instead of 25, that's not de-standardization of timing, it's just a shift in the norm. But if the ages at which people marry become much more spread out, some marrying at 22, others at 28, others at 35, others not at all, that suggests de-standardization of timing. The pattern is dissolving.
Got it. More spread out, more de-standardized.
Generally, yes, that's the indicator. Third, they looked at duration variance. Have the durations people stay in a given state increased in variability? For instance, does the length of time someone stays in their first job or in higher education become more spread out across the population? Some stay for years, others for months, making the duration less predictable.
Okay, prevalence, age variance, duration variance. What else?
Fourth, there's inter-event dependency. This examines. Has the association or link between different life events decreased? For example, was leaving the parental home once tightly linked to getting married or securing that first stable job? If that link weakens over time, if you can do one without necessarily doing the other.
Like moving out just to live alone or with roommates, not necessarily to get married.
Exactly. That's a form of de-standardization. The traditional package deal breaks apart.
Makes sense.
Fifth, sequence uniformity. Has the predictability of event sequences decreased? If the traditional sequence was, say, education, then work, then marriage, then children, and people start mixing those up, maybe having children before marriage or going back to education after years in the workforce that suggests de-standardization of the expected life sequence, the order gets jumbled.
Okay, the order matters too.
Yeah.
Anything else?
And finally, specifically for that idea of flexibility in work-related lives, they looked for indicators like increased job shifts, decreased firm tenure, how long you stay with one company, and decreased occupational stability, how long you stay in the same kind of work.
Right, the stuff we associate with the modern economy.
Exactly. But, and this is the author's crucial caveat, a single indicator changing isn't enough proof. You can't just point to one thing and say, aha, de-standardization.
Right.
Because, for instance, a delay in family formation could simply be a knock-on effect of people staying in education longer, not necessarily indicative of a broader de-standardization in the overall patterning of life courses. Or decreasing job stability might just be a temporary period effect, something specific to an economic downturn hitting a particular cohort, not a long-term societal trend towards de-standardization for everyone.
So you need a consistent pattern across multiple indicators.
Precisely. They stress that evidence for a general pervasive process of de-standardization requires consistent changes in most or all of these indicators across different life domains. It's about seeing the whole forest, not just one shaky-looking tree.
Okay, that makes sense. Rigorous. So to put these rigorous indicators to the test, they used the German life history study. Can you give us a quick overview of this data set? How comprehensive is it, and why is it such a goldmine for understanding these long-term trends?
The German Life History Study, or GLHS, is truly a remarkable resource. It's a long-running research program directed by Karl Ulrich Mayer, one of the paper's authors, that collected incredibly detailed retrospective life course information from various birth cohorts of West German nationals.
Retrospective meaning they asked people to look back.
Yes, they interviewed people and meticulously recorded their life histories when they left school, started jobs, moved house, got married, had kids, everything year by year, sometimes month by month.
Wow.
And the scope is what makes it so powerful. As we said, it covers birth cohorts spanning from 1919 all the way up to 1971. Imagine being able to compare the life paths of people who lived through Weimar Germany, the Third Reich, World War II, the post-war Reconstruction,
Incredible historical sweep.
with those who grew up in the economic boom years, the Wirtschaftswunder, and then the social upheavals of the late 20th century. They built this data set through several waves of data collection over decades, carefully adding new cohorts.
But they kept adding younger people as time went on.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note the observation window varies. For the earliest cohorts, born around 1920, they were observed up to their mid-60s, giving a fairly complete picture of much of their adult lives. In contrast, the youngest cohort in this paper, born in 1971, was interviewed at age 27.
So you only see their early adulthood.
Precisely. Their later life course transitions, like peak career years, maybe later marriages or childbirth, retirement couldn't be fully observed at the time of this analysis. That difference in observation window is crucial to keep in mind when interpreting the findings, especially for the youngest generations. Some things just haven't had time to happen yet for them in the data.
Good point. And how reliable is this data? Asking people to remember their whole lives seems tricky.
It is tricky, but they were incredibly meticulous. The samples for all parts of the GLHS were carefully evaluated against official statistics, like census data, to ensure they were truly representative of their respective populations in West Germany. The survey itself contained incredibly detailed questions about everything: family background, where they lived, education, every job held, any work interruptions, family formation, including non-marital unions, which is important, plus children. And all interviews underwent rigorous checks for errors and chronological consistency. They even recontacted many respondents to clear up inconsistencies.
Wow, that's dedication.
It is. It allowed the researchers to reconstruct these life histories as fully and accurately as possible. It's like having an incredibly detailed, verified biography for thousands of individuals, which allows for a really profound understanding of societal shifts, much deeper than you'd get from just snapshot surveys.
Okay, incredible data set. Let's dive into the actual findings then, starting with that first big area, the school, training, and work nexus. This is often an area we perceive as becoming incredibly flexible, maybe even chaotic. The most obvious trend the paper highlights here is consistent delay in major life course transitions. Can you elaborate on what they found there?
Yes, the data clearly shows this pattern of delay, almost like a universal societal hit pause button, getting longer across the cohorts in this public domain of life. Take leaving school, for instance. The median age, the age by which half the cohort had left, rose significantly across the generations.
How much?
For men, it went from around 14 years old for the 1920 cohort, remember, war impacts there too, to over 17 years old for the 1971 cohort. Women showed a strikingly similar increase.
Okay, so people are staying in school longer. Not surprising, maybe.
Not hugely surprising, no. It reflects increases in mandatory schooling age and just the general expansion of secondary and tertiary education. More and more Germans were completing higher levels of schooling over this period.
Right. What about finishing training after school?
The delay is even more dramatic when we look at completing training, whether that's vocational training, apprenticeships, or university degrees. For men who started any training, the completion age rose from around 19 years old for the 1920 cohort to a peak of nearly 25 years old for the 1955 cohort. That's a big jump.
Yeah, 6 years later on average.
And for women, the increase was more gradual but still steady, rising from about 18 to over 21 years old. This significant jump, particularly for men around those 1950s and 60s birth cohorts, highlights what the authors term the waiting hall effect.
The waiting hall. Explain that.
Well, the difficult labor market conditions in the mid-1970s and 1980s, which hit right when these 1955 and 1960 cohorts were in their early 20s.
Bad timing for them.
Terrible timing. It very likely contributed to them spending more time in the educational system. Education, in a way, served as a waiting hall for young people who had limited prospects in the job market. They kept studying, maybe got another degree, built more credentials, rather than entering a stagnant job market.
So they were stuck in education, basically.
Some might have felt that way. These specific cohorts, 1955 and 1960, were for this very reason nicknamed the postponed generation. Their entry into what was considered full adulthood was significantly delayed by these external economic forces.
Okay, so it's crystal clear that things are being delayed. Education takes longer. But my intuition still nags me.
Yeah.
If things are delayed, surely they must also be less standardized in terms of when people experience them. Is delayed automatically equal to de-standardized? Or is it possible that everyone is just delaying things together, shifting the whole pattern later?
That is precisely the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where the nuance really comes in, because the answer is not a straightforward yes. While events are certainly delayed, the variability in their timing that spread we talked about doesn't always follow the de-standardization hypothesis, at least not consistently in this nexus of school, training, and work.
Really? So it's not just chaos?
Not necessarily chaos in timing. Let's look at age variation. For leaving school, there is only a moderate increase in how spread out the ages were. For men, the spread of ages roughly doubled across the generations. Now, doubling sounds like a lot. But the authors describe it as actually quite modest, suggesting that despite the overall delay, most people were still leaving school within a fairly similar age window relative to each other. This is not strong evidence for de-standardization of timing.
Okay, so school leaving times stayed relatively bunched up just later. What about finishing training? More variation there.
For training completion, the picture is a bit more mixed, and it differs by gender. Variation did increase strongly for women from the 1950 cohort onwards, peaking with that 1955 cohort. So more varied timing for women finishing training.
Okay.
However, for men, the variation actually declined steeply after those war-affected early cohorts, before rising again slightly for the 1950s cohorts. The 1920 cohort, hit hard by the war, showed the greatest dispersion in training completion age, but then it significantly decreased for subsequent cohorts before ticking up a bit.
So for men, it actually got more standardized for a while after the war?
In terms of age variation at training completion, yes. So overall, for the school training work nexus, the authors conclude that the expected general increase of age variation under the de-standardization hypothesis is largely non-existent, or rather small. It's not the explosion of timing variation you might intuitively expect from the delay.
Huh. Okay, that's surprising. But did anything else change in the structure of education and training?
Yes, something else did change quite significantly for younger cohorts. The incidence of multiple training spells.
Meaning people going back for more training.
Exactly. Or starting one thing, stopping, starting something else. More than half of men born around 1955 and 1960 started more than 2 distinct training episodes, compared to less than a third for earlier cohorts.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It is. And for women, having 2 or more training episodes also became much more common from the 1950 cohort onwards. This means the sequencing of training and work became fuzzier. People weren't just completing one training program and then moving linearly into work. They were going back, stacking credentials, maybe exploring different vocational paths. This is a point that does suggest a form of de-standardization, specifically in the order and number of educational experiences, if not necessarily the timing variance.
Okay, so the path itself became more complex, more back and forth, even if the exit ages didn't spread out massively.
That seems to be the picture. And another really striking finding here is the gender convergence in the education and training realm.
Convergence, meaning men and women became more similar.
Exactly. Those marked gender differences in the number of started and completed training spells that were really typical for older cohorts. Well, they had pretty much disappeared by the 1955 cohort. Even though women, on average, still finished training a bit earlier than men, their overall engagement with multiple training episodes became much more similar.
So their educational paths looked more alike.
Much more alike. And this points strongly towards homogenization, not de-standardization, when it comes to gender roles in education and initial work paths. Their paths became more similar over time, which is a key counterpoint to the idea of universal individualization, making everyone completely different.
That's genuinely fascinating. Convergence, not divergence, between genders in education.
Yeah.
Okay, so while some aspects of education and training show increased complexity, like multiple spells, the overall timing doesn't consistently become less standardized. It's not a free-for-all. Let's shift to the actual work transitions now. What do the findings say about work life itself? Is it becoming more stable or more flexible? This is another area where the popular narrative often screams gig economy and constant job hopping.
Yeah.
What did the German data show?
You're right. The common narrative suggests a really chaotic, insecure labor market. But when we look at the actual work transitions in this German data, the picture again holds some surprises that challenge those common perceptions. Let's start with labor market entry. The median age remained comparatively stable across the cohorts,
Really? Even with longer education?
even with longer education. For men, it hovered consistently around ages 18 to 20. For women, it increased a bit more, from under 17 maybe to about 20 for the later cohorts. But significantly, for the three youngest cohorts studied, born 1964, 1971, earlier gender differences in entry age virtually disappeared.
So again, convergence.
Again, convergence. Both men and women were entering the labor market within a relatively narrow range of ages, similar to the pattern seen for leaving school and training completion, with the main exception being that war-disrupted 1920 cohort.
Okay, stable entry age. What about job hopping? Are people changing jobs more often?
This is where it gets a bit nuanced. If we look at the average number of jobs held up until age 27, it was remarkably stable across most cohorts.
The total number of jobs.
Yeah, the total number of distinct jobs by age 27. It was around 2.2 to 2.4 jobs for men and around 1.9 to 2.1 for women. Only the very youngest cohort, born in 1971, for both men and women, and the very oldest, the 1920 cohort for women, showed slightly higher mobility, averaging around 3 jobs by age 27. But for most of the period, the total number of jobs held in early adulthood didn't actually change much.
So not necessarily more jobs overall. But is there a but?
There is a but.
Yeah.
This is where it gets interesting. The rate of job shifts did change because these later cohort members entered the labor market later, having spent more time in the educational system.
Right, they had less time in the workforce by age 27.
Exactly. So the number of jobs per year of actual labor force participation did increase for cohorts born after 1950. The rate of job shifts more than doubled for men born in 1971 compared to earlier cohorts.
Okay, so the same number of jobs, roughly, but squeezed into fewer working years early on.
Precisely. It means their early work lives felt more dynamic, maybe more turbulent, because the changes were happening more frequently within the time they were working. The authors attribute this partly to increased unemployment and more involuntary firm switches for younger cohorts, particularly hitting that 1971 cohort, whose risk of unemployment was comparatively higher in their early careers.
So more frequent changes, possibly forced changes, but not necessarily a total abandonment of career paths. What about occupational stability? Were they changing types of work more?
That's the crucial question, and despite this higher rate of job shifts per year, what's really key is that the authors found no significant decrease in occupational stability for the cohorts born between 1960 and 1971.
No decrease. So they stayed in the same field.
Largely, yes. It means while people might have moved between different firms or employers more often, possibly due to those economic pressures, they generally stayed within the same broad occupational field or cluster of similar jobs. So the perception of increased flexibility in work life appears to be more about the frequency of job changes the churn, often involuntary, and less about a complete dismantling of long-term occupational continuity. It's not as if people were constantly retraining for entirely new fields in these cohorts, at least not by age 27.
Okay, wow. So putting it all together for this school training work nexus, what does it all mean? The data here offers a really important counterpoint to those common beliefs about the de-standardization of work lives. It's a very different picture than popular discourse often paints, isn't it?
It really is. The big takeaway for this public sphere of life is that while transitions are certainly prolonged, no doubt about that, and there's arguably more differentiation in terms of things like multiple training spells and fuzzier sequences between education and work, the data reveals a high degree of long-term stability regarding the standardization of timing and the overall orderliness of sequences. That expected general increase in age variation that the de-standardization hypothesis predicts simply isn't consistently there, or it's quite small. It's not the free-for-all, everyone does their own thing picture that the patchwork biography narrative often implies for this part of life.
So less chaos, more structure than we think.
More underlying structure, yes. And instead, what we largely seem to observe are strong period effects, these disruptions or influences that affect a specific generation during a particular historical time, rather than a continuous linear trend of de-standardization washing over all cohorts equally.
Like the war or the 80s recession.
Exactly. The disruption of World War II significantly impacted the 1920 cohort's life courses, leading to more heterogeneous, spread-out patterns for them because of those extreme circumstances. Similarly, the labor market difficulties of the mid-70s and 80s led to the postponed generation effect for the 1955 and 1960 cohorts, causing them to spend more time in education. And the increased job mobility rate for the 1971 cohort seems linked to higher unemployment risks impacting their specific early careers. These look more like specific responses to external conditions, not necessarily evidence of a universal, ongoing process of de-standardization.
That makes sense. Period effects, not necessarily a fundamental reshaping of the whole system.
And in fact, remember, one of the strongest and most striking trends the study identifies in this sphere is the convergence of men's and women's life courses in education and labor.
Right, becoming more similar.
Which is a homogenizing trend. It means their paths are becoming more alike over time, which is the exact opposite of de-standardization or individualization in terms of gender roles in this public sphere. So the picture in education and work, based on this German data up to the 1971 cohort, is far more structured and consistent, especially in its timing, than popular narratives might suggest. Your path through school and your early career might actually look surprisingly similar to your peers, despite what you might read about flexible, modern lives.
Okay, that is a huge takeaway. Stability and even convergence where we might expect fragmentation. Now let's shift gears completely. Let's move to the household and family formation nexus. The abstract of the paper highlighted this area showing the most pronounced changes. Do we finally see that dramatic de-standardization here that the popular narrative suggests? Is this where the script really got thrown out?
This is indeed where the story changes quite significantly. If the public sphere showed surprising stability and standardization, the private sphere of family formation is where the de-standardization thesis finds its strongest empirical support in this study.
Okay, let's break it down. What about leaving home and marriage first?
Right. So leaving home, forming your own household. The median age actually declined somewhat across cohorts, moving from the late 20s for the 1920 cohort down to the early 20s for younger cohorts.
Oh, people left home earlier.
A bit earlier, yeah. While there was high variability for that war-affected 1920 cohort, the age variation declined steeply until the 1950 cohort, then showed only a modest increase for younger men. And residential mobility, the number of times people moved by age 27, was generally stable across cohorts, fluctuating between 2 and 3 residences, except for that highly mobile 1920 cohort affected by the war. So leaving home itself doesn't show massive de-standardization.
Okay. But what about marriage? That feels like a big one.
It is. The real shifts begin with first marriage. Now, by U.S. standards, West Germans tend to marry relatively late anyway. The median age for first marriage was already quite late for men in the 1920 cohort, almost 28. It dropped a bit for the middle cohorts, but then significantly it increased again for cohorts born from 1955 onwards, extending towards age 30.
So marriage got later again for younger generations.
Yes, and for the youngest cohort studied, born in 1971, the median age for first marriage couldn't even be fully observed by age 27 within the study's timeframe, meaning more than half of them simply hadn't married yet by that age.
Wow. Okay, delay is clear. But what about prevalence? Are fewer people getting married?
This is truly striking, and perhaps the clearest single indicator of change. The prevalence of marriage, the proportion of people married by age 27 declined dramatically for younger cohorts.
How dramatically?
Get this, only 17% of men born in 1971 were married by age 27. Just 17%. Compare that to 64% for the 1940 cohort.
64% down to 17, that's huge.
It's enormous. They were almost 4 times more likely to be married by that age back then. Even the cohort born just before them in 1960 was twice as likely to be married at age 27 as the 1971 cohort.
And women.
Women showed a similarly steep decline. It went from a peak of 85% married by age 27 for the 1940 cohort, 85%, down to just 27% for the 1971 cohort.
Wow. So marriage is definitely less of a universal thing in early adulthood.
Undeniably, it's a profound shift away from marriage being that expected, almost automatic life stage early on.
Okay, that's prevalence. But what's fascinating here is that point we keep coming back to. A delay or decline in prevalence doesn't automatically mean destandardization of timing if everyone just delays it together or opts out together.
Yeah.
So what about the variation in timing? Is everyone just marrying later, or are people getting married at all sorts of different ages now, truly scattering the pattern?
This is precisely where the destandardization hypothesis finds its strongest, most compelling support in the data for the family sphere. For those older cohorts, born around 1940 and 1950, marriage was genuinely age-structured. If you look at the graphs in the paper showing when people got married, you see these clear, steep peaks. It means most people married at very similar, predictable ages within those cohorts. It was a well-defined age range, almost like a social timetable.
Okay, a clear peak. What about the younger cohorts?
For cohorts born after 1955, the curves for marriage timing flattened out significantly. The peaks become much lower, and the tails get much wider and fatter.
Meaning the ages are more spread out.
Exactly. It indicates that experiences became far more varied within these younger cohorts. There was no longer a clear, dominant age at which people married. Instead, some married early, some in their late 20s, some in their 30s, and as we saw, a growing proportion not at all by age 27. This pattern of increased variability was observed for both men and women.
So the timing really did become less predictable.
Very much so, although the authors note it was generally more age-structured for women overall, meaning their peaks were still a bit more pronounced than men's, even as the variability increased for both. For men born around 1950, for instance, the data actually showed several smaller peaks, early 20s, mid-20s, early 30s, which might suggest marriage timing was being structured by different educational pathways. But for the younger cohorts after that, even those multiple peaks seem to dissolve into a much flatter distribution.
Okay, clear destandardization in marriage timing. What about having children? Does that follow the same pattern?
If anything, the patterns of delay and destandardization are even more pronounced for first childbirth. The median age for having a first child was later for younger cohorts, so much so that, like marriage, the full age range couldn't even be observed for the youngest cohorts within the study's observation window. Many just hadn't had kids yet.
And the proportion having kids, did that drop too?
Sharply. Similar to marriage, the proportion of men and women who had a child by age 27 declined steeply for younger cohorts. For example, only 11% of men born in 1971 had become fathers by age 27, compared to 43% for men born in 1940.
Wow, 11% versus 43.
Huge drop. And women showed a similar dramatic fall from a peak of 68% being mothers by age 27 for the 1940 cohort, down to just 27% for the 1971 cohort.
So fewer parents by that age. And the timing, more spread out like marriage.
Yes, critically, for childbirth timing variations similar to marriage, the age at first childbirth varies much more within cohorts for younger generations. The peaks in the age distributions are less pronounced. The curves are much more spread out and flatter. For women born around 1950, you could still see a pattern of differentiation, maybe an early peak and a later flatter peak. But for the 1955 and 1960 cohorts, the curves really spread out, with a substantial proportion having their first child well into their 30s.
So the evidence for destandardization in family timing, both marriage and kids, is very strong.
Very strong indeed. It's clear that people are not only delaying starting families, but they're doing so at a much wider, less predictable range of ages. The old timetable is gone.
Okay. Beyond these individual events like marriage or childbirth, what about how these family events relate to other life stages? You mentioned inter-event dependency earlier. Is there a broader decoupling occurring? Are the traditional bundles of life events breaking apart in the family sphere too?
Yes, that's another key finding that connects the two major life spheres we've been examining, the public world of work education and the private world of family. The data shows an increasing decoupling of events in the connections between the school training work nexus and family formation.
Meaning they don't happen together as much.
Exactly. For example, forming an independent household is no longer necessarily coupled with getting married or even having that stable job first. In earlier cohorts, these transitions were often tightly bundled. You finish school, got a job, got married, moved out, had kids, often in a fairly predictable sequence, like dominoes falling.
Right, one led to the next.
Now, those links are much looser. People might live independently for years or even have children without necessarily being married or having the stable career path that was once considered the prerequisite. It's like the individual components of the life script are no longer chained together in the same way, giving people more apparent freedom or maybe just different constraints in how they sequence them.
The package deal is broken.
The package deal is broken, or at least significantly reconfigured. And one other important point here. Remember how we saw gender convergence in the education work sphere?
Yeah, men and women becoming more similar.
Well, here in the family formation nexus, gender differences persist. Unlike the convergence we saw in education and labor force participation in family formation, there are still distinct differences between men and women's timing and patterns across all the cohorts studied.
Such as?
Women generally still marry and have children earlier than men on average, and while the variability has increased for both genders, these underlying gender-specific patterns endure. So while family life is clearly de-standardizing in terms of timing and prevalence, it's not necessarily becoming gender neutral in its patterns. Gender still structures family life quite strongly.
Interesting. So convergence in public life, persistent difference in private life, alongside de-standardization in private life. It's complex.
It is definitely complex.
Yeah. Okay, let's try to pull this all together. What's the big picture here? The idea of de-standardization is so popular, so widely accepted in public discourse. It feels intuitively true for many of us. But this deep dive into the German data reveals a much, much more nuanced reality than the sweeping generalizations we often hear. What's the ultimate verdict from Bruckner and Mayer? Where does the evidence point most strongly?
Right, the bottom line. Bruckner and Mayer's core conclusion is incredibly precise, and yes, it really challenges that conventional wisdom. They found considerable, undeniable evidence supporting the de-standardization thesis, but primarily in the area of private lives, especially family formation, marriage, and childbirth.
Okay, so it is happening, but mainly there.
Mainly there, yes. And this was clearly coupled with some degree of deinstitutionalization, like the rapid spread of non-marital unions becoming common before marriage, and also a clear pluralization of family forms, with increased divorce, single parenthood becoming more visible, etc.
And what drove those changes in private life?
They argue this development in private lives seems to have been primarily triggered by three major long-term societal shifts we discussed. First, educational expansion, which had that significant delaying effect on family formation. Second, those pronounced value changes emphasizing autonomy and self-realization that really took root from the early 1970s. And third, intricately related to both of those, the women's movement, which encouraged women to pursue education and careers independently of traditional family roles. It represents a genuine revolution in how private life is structured and timed.
A revolution in private life. But what about public life, education, and work?
In stark contrast, they found little support for the de-standardization thesis in the spheres of education, training, and work. While it's true, as we saw, that these transitions have been prolonged and they've become more differentiated in some ways, like more training spells, fuzzier sequences between school and work, the authors emphasize that there's a high degree of long-term stability regarding the standardization of timing and age variation in these public life spheres. With the possible exception of that increasing variability in the age women completed training, the expected general increase of age variation that the de-standardization hypothesis predicts simply isn't consistently there, or it's quite small.
So stability in the timing, even if the path is a bit more complex.
Exactly. This is a really crucial distinction, and it often gets lost in the broader narrative that paints everything as becoming fluid and unpredictable. Much of the perceived de-standardization in the work sphere, for example, might be better attributed to those strong period effects we talked about, rather than a general linear trend across all cohorts.
Right, the war cohort, the recession cohort, specific circumstances.
Precisely. The experience of the 1920 war and post-war cohorts was uniquely heterogeneous due to those historical circumstances. The 1955 and 1960 labor market crunch cohorts experienced prolonged training periods due to specific economic difficulties hitting them at a key life stage. And the 1971 cohort saw an increase in job mobility rate, largely attributed to higher unemployment risks impacting their specific early careers. These look more like specific responses to specific historical circumstances, not necessarily evidence of a universal, ongoing de-standardization of the underlying structure.
And instead of de-standardization in public life?
Instead, what we actually saw as a dominant trend in the education and labor sphere was that persistent trend towards homogenization, especially regarding gender. Men's and women's life courses in these areas became remarkably similar over time. It's almost the opposite of individualized chaos. It's convergence.
Wow. Okay, that is a powerful and frankly surprising conclusion, challenging so much of what we hear every day. The researchers end with some important cautionary notes, don't they? Reminding us that social science isn't always about finding grand, sweeping narratives that explain everything. What are their final reflections on the scope of their findings and maybe what comes next for this fascinating area of study?
They do offer important caveats. First, they acknowledge very responsibly that they've only examined a selective set of indicators, and these mostly relate to the early and middle parts of life transitions up to the late 20s or 30s for most cohorts.
So not the whole life course.
Not the whole life course. Their verdict on de-standardization isn't necessarily a definitive statement about the entire span of life, especially later life transitions like retirement, where variability might still be increasing in ways they couldn't capture fully here. The story isn't fully told yet, particularly for later life.
Okay, good point. What else?
Second, they raise the important point that West Germany might be a special case. Its specific institutional environment, particularly its highly structured vocational training system and its occupationally segmented labor markets, might exert stronger structuring influences on life courses compared to other advanced societies, like maybe the US or the UK.
Ah, so the German context matters.
It might matter significantly. This could mean that what holds true for Germany might not apply universally. The degree of standardization or de-standardization could look different in countries without those specific institutional structures shaping education and work. They don't claim universal applicability for these specific patterns, reminding us that context is key.
Right. Germany isn't everywhere. Any final thoughts from them?
Finally, despite the clear contrast between what their rigorous data shows for the past decades and how contemporary commentators often interpret the social condition as universally fluid, the authors are quite hesitant to extrapolate these trends too far into the future. They actually hint that the most recent cohort they observed, the 1971 cohort, shows indications of profound change, like that dramatic drop in marriage prevalence that may require more time to see their full significance.
So things might still be changing dramatically, we just can't see the full picture yet.
It's possible the shifts might be accelerating or taking new forms for the very youngest adults not fully captured here. They emphasize, though, that systematic data and the facts derived from them are a far better starting point for understanding life course patterns than mere speculation or relying on popular narratives. The mechanisms producing these patterns are complex, they tell us, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of understanding them fully. It's an ongoing investigation.
A necessary dose of scientific humility. So, what does this deep dive mean for you listening? It truly challenges that common narrative that all aspects of life are becoming universally flexible and individualized. While your personal family life, your choices about partnership, marriage, parenthood might feel wonderfully unique and self-directed, maybe far removed from your grandparents' experiences.
And the data supports that feeling of change there.
Exactly. But remember, your journey through education and work might actually be more structured and perhaps more similar to your peers than you perceive, especially in societies with strong institutional frameworks like Germany's. This begs a fascinating question, doesn't it? How much of our perceived individualized lives are truly chosen freedom, a deliberate step off the beaten path, and how much is simply an adaptation to new but still structured societal conditions and constraints?
A really key question. Is it choice or constraint driving these patterns?
And what might this mean for future generations if family lives continue to diversify and destandardize, while work lives, at least in some societies, remain relatively stable, maybe even homogenizing for gender roles? It's definitely something to mull over as you navigate your own unique, yet perhaps surprisingly typical path through modern life.